you mentioned crime, Jasmine, and we can now bring into the discussion criminal lawyer Nick Freeman, another on-the-money regular. Nick, good to see you as ever. What do you think of the fact that it's taken so long to move from a voluntary code, which only came in on APP fraud in 2019, and within 2 years, the government's admitted it's not working?
Yeah, well, the consultation period is still ongoing. It carries on till January. It's too long, too much money's gone. The banks need to assume responsibility. So my answer is it should have happened much sooner, but at least it's going to happen. And as you say, so many people are embarrassed to complain. They feel ashamed of what they've done. And these scams are so sophisticated. It's very hard to find someone who hasn't actually been successfully scammed. Most people have, if you ask them, have been scammed, victims of scams. And at least now, and of course, it's important to bear in mind, the police aren't interested anymore. So from a police perspective, these terrible offences, which are very destructive for human life, are not really investigated by the police. The police say, look, speak to the bank, it's not our problem, we haven't got the resources. So as far as Joe Public is concerned, well, it's not even a matter for the police anymore. It's almost decriminalising what is a very serious offence. So it's not before time. The banks are now going to be transparent. They're going to be shamed, I think, into revealing how prevalent this fraud is and how little support they give. And hopefully, we haven't seen the legislation yet. We know what it's intended to demonstrate. But I don't think in every case it's going to be mandatory for the banks to reimburse. I think they're going to be much more obliged to reimburse. But I think a provision that is going to compel them in every case to reimburse probably won't hit the statute book. It'd be very interesting to see, because there are circumstances, of course, where some people are negligent and they bring this problem about their own negligence. And it's right that the bank shouldn't be responsible for that.
Yeah. Tony, you're CEO of Get Safe Online, as we've said, but you were previously one of our boys in blue, and we thank you for your service. But Nick's got a point, hasn't he? It is very difficult for the police to investigate online fraud. It's very, very sophisticated. And I think he is onto something when he says a lot of the public think the police aren't interested in this area.
I absolutely agree with Nick. I was a policeman a long time ago, and I've been slightly embarrassed with some of the results that I've seen coming through the feedback that I get from serving police officers. And I remember I was still in the job when legislations changed, where reporting went from reporting to the police, and it was mandated that you reported to the banks. And what can the banks do in relation to actually arresting people? I think it's a great shame. It reduces the amount of crime being reported because it's not part of the crime statistics. And I think this is dreadful. I think it's such a shame that the one or two banks, maybe a few more, that have been successful and been very good at it, have been dragged down by those appalling banks that haven't been looking after their customers, haven't signed up to the basics of codes. And it is disgraceful. And I agree with everything Nick says. Sometimes, and it's hard for me to say, I'm not proud of being an ex-police officer, but I don't think it's the police officers on the street. I think it's the government that are doing this type of problem with them, and the senior officers who are complying.
Joel, I mentioned two newspapers there who deserve congratulations for getting us to this point with the mandatory code coming in. I should add Age UK, your own organisation, also Age Concern, which many, many fabulous organisations like your own. I know you'll be looking at the legislation very closely, monitoring it as it goes through the Commons, looking for amendments that are watering down the spirit of it. What do you want to see in that legislation to make it really bulletproof?
Really what it does is give the PSR, the watchdog, the city regulator, the power to actually set their own regulation. And so it might be a bit of a longer process, but maybe the first step is really just giving the regulator, the watchdog, the right tools and the right teeth to actually enforce and supervise this new regulation. We hope we can get it out in the Queen's speech next year. We hope, we want to get it out in this Parliament as soon as possible. And then really, the PSR have already consulted before, Age UK and lots of other organisations respond to that consultation. This is the next phase of what they're doing, going out to industry, going out to consumer representatives, asking them what we should do. But, we need to make sure that gets right. But once that legislation is enacted and the regulation is enforced, then it's still going to mean proper supervision and enforcement to make sure that the banks are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. And one way of doing that is having that transparency, like you say, so that consumers can see this bank is treating people fairly, this bank is refunding people. If I'm a victim of a crime, I'm going to get my money back in a more straightforward way.
My reading of the runes so far, just talking, I've made a couple of phone calls this morning, reading about this new law coming in. I don't think it's going to be mandatory for banks to publish how many fraud victims they've had and how many fraud victims they've compensated.
Okay.
I think that will only happen, that transparency that Joel Lewis mentioned there, as a punishment. Surely, already that's wrong. It should be transparent from the get-go.
Yes, it should be. Yes, absolutely.
So it's a competition between banks to do good rather than not a competition among them to do bad.
Absolutely, yes. But what I'm also thinking, though, is that you know, to speak for the banks for a moment, there is an element here of us as well as the consumer. We do need to take responsibility. But I think the banks, what they also need to do is to have much more connection with other banks around the world, because this is an international problem. They are doing it already, but I think we need to see much more so that they can not be constantly on the back foot behind these scammers who, as I say, have very deep pockets. They're doing it all the time. It's a professional job for them.
Nick Freeman, last word to you as our resident lawyer on this panel, if I may. What do you want to see in this legislation to make it bulletproof so the banks can't fail to implement exactly the spirit of what we're trying to do here?
Well, I'd like to see the transparency that you just alluded to become law. That should become law so that the public can look at every bank and see actually who's got the intelligence, who's taking the right precautions, who's actually looking after their customer. That's one thing that I'd like to see. I'd also like assurances that when this comes in, the costs aren't actually going to be passed on to the customer, because, of course, there is going to be a massive cost implication. Who is going to bear that? And I suspect, unfortunately, it's going to be the bank customer, isn't it? So they need to be safeguarded against that. And I'd like to see legislation that really compels the bank in the vast majority of cases to reimburse, not to hang people out to dry and make them go to the financial ombudsman, because that's a lengthy process and it does destroy lives. And it's very unfair for that to happen.
Well, you know what? We've had quite a few discussions here on the money since early September when we began, but I'm particularly proud of that one. A really important set of comments from all of you. Thank you all for your time here on the money. We will be keeping an eye on that legislation too. Policymaker at Age UK, Joel Lewis there, ex-policeman and CEO of Get Safe Online, Tony Neate, our criminal lawyer, Nick Freeman, and of course, Jasmine Birtles, who's going to stay with us